In the flickering candlelight of old St. Peter's Basilica, on Christmas Day in the year 800, a king knelt in prayer. Pope Leo III approached silently, lifted a crown of gold, and placed it upon his brow. Charles the Great, Charlemagne, rose not as king, but as emperor. Over that moment hangs a persistent question. Why this act on this holy day above all others? The air in Rome hummed with tension that December. Charlemagne, ruler of the Franks, had forged a vast dominion from the remnants of Old Gaul and the German lands, a patchwork of conquered tribes and loyal vassals. Yet Italy simmered with unrest, and the papacy stood exposed. The city's ancient aristocracy watched the new pope with cold, calculating eyes. Leo III had ascended the papal throne in 795. Of humble origin, he poured Frankish gold into Rome's churches and charities, winning the affection of many ordinary Romans. But the old nobility seethed at this outsider who owed his position to neither lineage nor their favour. To them, he was a usurper, a man unworthy of St. Peter's seat. In 799, their resentment erupted into violence. During a solemn procession through the streets of Rome, a mob attacked Leo. They dragged him down, clawed at his face, and tried to blind him and tear out his tongue. Somehow he escaped, battered and bloodied, and fled north across the Alps to Charlemagne's court at Paderborn. There, the Frankish king received him with ceremony. Leo brought gifts heavy with symbolism, the keys to St. Peter's tomb and the banner of Rome. They were tokens of submission, acknowledgements that the Pope looked to the Frankish ruler for protection. Charlemagne pledged his aid. When the time was right, he marched south with his army and entered Rome in November 800 to cheering crowds and wary nobles. A council convened to address the charges that Leo's enemies had levelled against him. Accusers came forward, alleging adultery and perjury. Charlemagne, presiding over the proceedings, declared that no earthly court could sit in judgment over a pope. Instead, Leo would answer before God alone. On December 23rd in St. Peter's, the Pope swore his innocence on the Gospels. Outwardly, justice had been done. Inwardly, the balance of power in Christendom was shifting. Beyond Rome, deeper currents swirled. The Eastern Empire, long the guardian of the imperial title, offered no firm shield. In Constantinople, the throne was held by Empress Irene, who had seized power after having her own son blinded. Many in the West viewed her rule as tainted, and some deemed a woman unfit to be Emperor of the Romans. To Western eyes, the imperial dignity seemed to hang vacant. The memory of the last Western emperor, Romulus Augustulus, had faded into legend since his fall in 476. Yet the idea of empire never died. In Charlemagne's court, scholars whispered of renewal. Alcuin of York, the king's learned advisor, already spoke of the Frankish realm as an empire in his letters. The language of Rome of Augustus and Constantine was returning to the vocabulary of a Frankish king. Christmas Eve in Rome passed in a haze of ceremony and unease. Charlemagne attended the services in St. Peter's, surrounded by bishops, nobles, and soldiers. Some later said he mistrusted Leo's intentions and feared being used. Others claimed that the plan for an imperial coronation had been laid out a year earlier at Paderborn, the entire drama carefully staged. The sources do not agree, and the truth lies somewhere in the shadows between them. Dawn broke on the 25th. Bells rang out across the Tiber as pilgrims and nobles crowded into the Basilica. Torchlight glinted off mosaics and marble, off helmets and jewelled vestments. The Mass began, Latin chant rising and falling beneath the vaulted ceiling. Charlemagne entered in royal robes, his son Charles the Younger at his side, and processed towards the altar. As the king rose from prayer, some accounts say he bowed his head in reverence. Leo moved. The Pope lifted the golden crown and, in a clear voice that cut through the incense-laden air, proclaimed, "To Charles, most pious Augustus, crowned by God, great and peace-bringing emperor, life and victory." The crowd answered with a roar of acclamation. Leo then anointed the young Charles as king. In that instant, the Frankish ruler stood transformed in the eyes of many. No longer just a powerful king, but emperor. The choice of Christmas Day was no accident. The Feast of the Nativity celebrated the incarnation of God, the birth of Christ the King. To crown an emperor on that day was to bind earthly rule to a sacred story of divine kingship. Beneath the Christian festival lay the memory of older Roman celebrations, now overlaid but not forgotten. In that basilica, raised over the grave of St. Peter, the act echoed the ancient rites of empire, the elevation of Augustus, the triumphs of Constantine, now recast in Christian form. For Leo, the coronation was an act of survival and strategy. Charlemagne had restored him to his throne. Now, an emperor's protection would help secure it. With an emperor as ally, Leo could hope to overawe Rome's rebellious nobles and anchor papal authority in a broader political order. Gratitude mingled with calculation. By placing the crown on Charlemagne's head, the Pope also claimed the right to bestow imperial dignity. Future rulers would be reminded that their highest title came through the hands of St. Peter's successor. For Charlemagne, the new title gave form to a reality already taking shape. His armies had subdued Saxony and pushed into the Spanish March. His authority stretched from the North Sea to central Italy. The imperial crown sanctified this power and set him on a level with the rulers in Constantinople. Now he could be styled Imperator Romanorum, Emperor of the Romans, Protector of the Church, heir, at least in Western eyes, to the legacy of Rome. His biographer Einhard later insisted that Charlemagne was taken by surprise, that he would never have entered St. Peter's on Christmas Day had he known Leo's intentions. It is a convenient story, one that preserves the king's modesty and distances him from any hint of grasping ambition. Other sources, like the Lorsch Annals, suggest that the idea of imperial renewal had already been discussed, and that the focus of the Roman assemblies shifted naturally from Leo's vindication to the rebirth of empire. The debate over who truly orchestrated the coronation has never been fully settled. In Constantinople, the reaction was cold. Byzantine observers saw in Charlemagne's new title a usurpation of their ancient prerogative. Irene's government protested, though without the strength to reverse events in the distant west. Between the two halves of Christendom, a new fault line opened, one that would widen over the centuries. Yet in the short term, the crown's weight reshaped the Western world. Charlemagne's authority gained a new aura. His campaigns in Saxony, already brutal and relentless, now carried the added justification of imperial duty and Christian mission. From his palaces, he sponsored schools and scriptoria. Learning and the copying of texts flourished in what later generations would call the Carolingian Renaissance. Law codes were refined, church structures strengthened, and Latin culture given fresh vigour. The papacy too emerged with enhanced prestige. Leo's successors would invoke the memory of that Christmas coronation when they placed crowns on the heads of later rulers, Otto I, Frederick I, and, in a different age and style, Napoleon. The question of who stood higher, Pope or Emperor, would ignite bitter conflicts, from the investiture controversy to later struggles between throne and altar. The act in St. Peter's had set a pattern and a problem that Europe would wrestle with for centuries. Byzantium never accepted the Western claim to the Roman imperial title, and the estrangement between East and West deepened, contributing to the eventual schism between the Latin and Greek churches. Yet for a time, the idea of a united Christian commonwealth under an emperor and a pope inspired hopes of order in a fractured world. Charlemagne's empire, in various forms, would endure as what came to be called the Holy Roman Empire, casting a long shadow over European politics until its dissolution in 1806. Its roots trace back to that winter morning in Rome when a king's silent prayer ended with a crown descending on his head. On that Christmas day, as cold air settled over the Vatican Hill and candles burned low in old St. Peter's, raw power wrapped itself in the language of nativity and renewal. The coronation of Charlemagne did more than elevate a single ruler. It bound the memory of ancient Rome to the Christian West and set the course for an imperial idea that would shape Europe for a millennium.
If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing. Make sure to leave a comment with who you want covered next.